Welcome to our last unit in personality, which is the humanistic approach. This approach is really different from all the approaches that we've talked about so far, but I think each of them has been unique in its own way. So we're going to start with an introduction to this approach and focus on Carl Rogers, as the book did, because he's really the first person to kind of start this approach in personality and also in therapy. We'll talk about the Q sort, which is one of the ideas for how we can assess personality using this approach. That will be the first mini lecture. The second mini lecture will talk about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And then the last one, we'll talk about this guy whose name is Csikszentmihalyi and a critique of the approach. So let's start by talking about what is the humanistic approach all about. Okay, so basically, the humanistic approach thinks about each individual person as their current needs. Who are you right now? And what would be your best self? So it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier with Tori Higgins' idea of actual and ideal self. But the idea is, how can we make sure that you are fully functioning, that you have realized your best potential, that there aren't aspects of your personality that are kind of holding you back and stopping you from reaching your best self? So what do we mean by fully functioning our best self? We have some qualities from this approach that we say mean that you really are kind of achieving your full potential. The first is that you are open to experiences. So we talked about that as one of the big 5 personality traits way back in the trait perspective. But the humanistic approach is that to be fully functioning, you need to be open to new ideas. If you have the opportunity to travel to a new place, you say, that's great. If you have the opportunity to interact with someone who's from a group, previously you didn't really like that group, maybe you were prejudiced toward this group, and now you have the opportunity to learn about their perspective. You think, that's a great opportunity. So you're open to the idea that your world so far has been limited and you want to expand your world. Another part of being fully functioning is always living in the moment. And that doesn't mean that you don't plan for the future or look fondly back on the past or learn from mistakes in the past. You do all of those things. But the idea is that you experience the present for what it is. If you're having a good moment, you really stop and appreciate that moment. If you're having a bad moment, you really think about, why is this moment bad and what can I learn from it? So you're really paying attention to yourself and to the environment. Another idea for fully functioning is that you're probably a nonconformist. You're living your authentic self. If something makes you happy and it doesn't hurt other people, you should do that thing. You should be yourself, even if society might look down upon you. Well, that's society's problem. It's not your problem. Do you. The last one is that you are going to experience heightened emotions if you're fully functioning. You're going to really, really, really feel happy sometimes. And you're going to really, really, really feel sad at other times. And that's okay. Part of living is feeling those emotions and not trying to bury them or sort of, lose them through like drugs or alcohol or something like that. You really want to feel the moment. You don't want to try to stop yourself from truly feeling. So it's a risky endeavor. It means that you might feel really sad or angry sometimes, but that's okay. All feelings are validated in the humanistic approach. So the humanistic approach, to summarize, is basically the idea that we want people to achieve growth and happiness and live their fullest lives. So Carl Rogers is the person who is usually associated with the humanistic approach. He's a well-known name in therapy. His version of therapy came from the humanistic approach, but he called it person-centered therapy because it was, how do we help the person? The person is what matters. So he importantly changed the terminology that counselors use. Up until Carl Rogers, people would often refer to the people they were helping as their patients. And he said, that's maybe a little bit condescending. There's a connotation there that they're broken. And so to be more respectful of them, we want to call them clients instead of patients. So he was responsible for that name change. He also thought that it's not up to the therapist to decide what you do in your therapy sessions. It should be up to the client. So the client could come in and say, you know what, I don't want to talk about my childhood today, or you know what, I do. And it's up to the client. They're the ones in control. He was very influential in psychology as well as in many other fields, and so he actually was eventually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a very influential figure. So, according to Carl Rogers and the humanistic approach, your personality is a function of your goals and needs and how far you are in achieving those goals and needs. So, how much are you living that fully functioning life? Importantly, you are responsible for your own functioning. You are the one in control of your life. You are the one who has to decide, I want to be fully functioning. So you have control and responsibility. Importantly, compared to other perspectives, you can't say the person I am is because of how I was raised. So you can't blame it on experiences like you might have been able to do in the behaviorist perspective. You can't blame it on hormones or genetics like you could have done in the biological perspective, right? So the difference between the humanistic perspective and the other perspectives we talked about so far, one of the main differences is that the humanistic perspective says you are the one in charge of your personality. It's a conscious choice that you are the person you are. And if you don't like that person, you are the only one who can change that. So it's very much a focus on responsibility and control. Rogers has four main emphases for how personality functions in the humanistic approach. The first is, again, personal responsibility. You can't ever say, well, I had to do this, I didn't have a choice. Of course you had a choice. You could have not done that. And there might have been negative consequences. You might have died, right? But that was still a choice. So the idea is you can't kind of get away from responsibility. You can't blame your environment. You can't blame your parents. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you react or respond to what happens to you. So again, you can't necessarily control your environment. Things happen that aren't your fault, that aren't your responsibility. What is your responsibility is how you respond to those things. So we shape our own selves and our own fates. The second point in the humanistic approach is called the here and now, which is the idea, again, that you need to focus on the present. So there's a current kind of fad in psychology called mindfulness. And we'll see how long this lasts. There's a lot of scientific research showing that mindfulness is more or less a placebo effect. But if it's helpful, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The idea of mindfulness or focus on the present is that, again, you need to appreciate what's happening to you right now and not just always be thinking about how you're going to be happier in the future or always be reminiscing about the past. So let's say that you get the opportunity to go on a trip to somewhere that you've always wanted to go. Let's just say it's Paris, okay? When you're in Paris, you need to be present. You need to think, wow, this is a beautiful place. The food is amazing. I'm experiencing all these wonderful things. I'm going to museums. You can't be thinking, wow, I really miss, home. You can miss home. Of course, that's a reasonable emotion. All emotions are reasonable in the humanistic approach. But you can't ruin your trip by constantly thinking about how you miss the people at home. Then what's the point of being on the trip? You also can't live your life only thinking about the future. You can't think, man, as soon as I graduate, as soon as I get that job, as soon as I get married, as soon as I have kids, then I'll be happy. You have to be happy now. You have to be happy and appreciate the things you have now. You can't always be thinking, I will be happy if. Why aren't you happy already? So the idea of appreciating what you have and being fully present is important in the humanistic approach. One of the things that you can do this unit, if you'd like, is there's a perspectives self-report scale on Canvas. This is actually created by Phil Zimbardo. And that's a way that you can kind of measure your perspective on, are you someone who thinks about the past, the present, or the future? A third idea in the humanistic approach is that it's a phenomenological approach. So phenomenology is basically the idea that reality is subjective and that every person's experience is going to be unique. So to fully understand you, I need to understand your perspective, your subjectivity. So Rogers talks about how there is a thing called reality, but we each experience that reality differently. And how that forms us is individual. So the phenomenological approach is about the individual person and their phenomenon of life. So an example of how this applies to research is the idea that we might get more out of qualitative research than quantitative research. Quantitative is going to be like a mass survey, 300 people take it, and you look at average scores and correlations or something like that. Whereas qualitative is interviews with actual people's words, people typing essays, but you're looking at their actual words, quotations from the participants. What are they actually representing as themselves? And it's a more sort of personal approach. The fourth and final idea for the humanistic approach is the focus on personal growth. So the entire idea of humanism in psychology, the humanistic perspective, not only in personality, but in the entire field of psychology, is the idea that our purpose of life is to grow, to fulfill our best selves. And it's not just to have our basic sort of biological needs met, it's to think about the psychology of who am I, how can I be better, how can I make the world a better place, how do I fulfill my own best potential. So this is going to relate to the second mini lecture when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and reaching the top of that pyramid. Okay, so Carl Rogers created a unique assessment tool called the Q-sort. You can read about this on page 135 of the book if you're using the current edition. But basically the Q-sort is a way that you can measure people's personality, not only their actual self, but their ideal self. You could use this in therapy settings or in research settings. It's kind of time consuming, but it's really insightful. So the way that this works is you give the client 100 cards. Each card has either a phrase or an adjective that could theoretically apply to them, their actual self or their ideal self. So it'll be things like generous will be on one card, or another card will say makes friends easily. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. And the person basically has to sort through the 100 cards. That's why it's called the Q-sort. And they make piles according to whether or not that card describes them or not in terms of their actual self. Who am I right now? And who do I want to be, my ideal self? So they'll do that twice, the actual self and the ideal self. Okay, so the way that the piles work is it looks like this figure that I've shown for you here. Okay, so they have to actually make choices. They can't say, all of these are true of me, or none of these are true of me. They can't be that kind of cut and dry. They have to think about the continuum, right, the spectrum. So what you can see here is that they have to choose only 5 cards that are not like me at all, and only 5 cards that are extremely like me. And then everything else is going to fall somewhere in the middle. So they have to make these choices. They have to differentiate. And again, you can see that this will help the therapist or the counselor or the researcher see what is your conception of who you are right now, what are your strengths and weaknesses. And then if you do this a second time, your ideal self, who is the person you would like to be? What kinds of traits would you like to get rid of? And what kinds of traits would you like to emphasize? So the way that this can work is actually, like I said, you're limited to the number of cards you can put in each pile. And what we can do is we can actually turn this into a numerical system to measure your growth over time. So let's say that each of the piles that we saw on the previous slide, let's say that we number these 1 to 9. And then we put each card, we give each card a number, right? So 5 cards will get the number 1, 5 cards will get the number 9. So what you can do is you can put a numerical system together where you can see, okay, what is the distribution of cards for actual self compared to the distribution of cards for ideal self. And the closer those two distributions are to each other, the higher the correlation, the more the person has achieved their ideal self, right? So you can see that if actual pile and ideal pile are pretty similar, there's going to be a high correlation, and that means they're doing pretty well. If they're very different from each other, so you have in actual self, you have one card that's over here, and an ideal self, it's all the way over here, that correlation is going to be really low. So you know they have a lot of work to do to get to the person they want to be. And what you can do is you can see if that correlation improves over time by having them do the Q-sort, let's say every 3 months, every 6 months. You can see whether they're getting closer to the person that they would like to be. Okay, that's it for part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. So see you soon.